Hello everyone, this is AndresRestart, and today what we're going to be doing is taking a closer look at Pokémon Winds and Waves and comparing the visuals to not only Pokémon Scarlet and Violet, but also new Pokémon Snap. People have seen the trailer for this Switch 2 exclusive title and have made a lot of remarks about how this looks a lot like new Pokémon Snap. But something I think people should keep in mind here, new Pokémon Snap was just limited areas on rails. That's very different from an open world experience. Recently, there's been this conversation online about Resident Evil Requiem and how Capcom should make the Resident Evil games open world. For the record, that should definitely not happen unless they have a really cool idea, but the way the games are currently structured I think is totally fine. I love it as is. It's not like the series is going stagnant or anything like that, but people have seen some really cool shots like in the city, and people think, wow, what if you could just explore everything? But what I don't think people are keeping in mind here is that that looks that good and has so much going on because it's actually only rendering a limited space. And the same applies for new Pokemon Snap, even if it's on Switch 1, it looks really good because they're focusing on just a limited space where you have limited movement. So for Pokemon Winds and Waves, for it to have similar looking visuals, and by the way, it's not just similar, it's better, but to have visuals that are kind of along those lines in an open world environment, that says a lot more. Not to mention, there's a lot going on here. It's not just the environment we see on the surface, but there's also some really cool weather effects going on. You have the winds, like notice we can actually see wind blowing, we can see it impacting the clouds above us, for example. There's a lot more going on with the weather and the physics of this game, which also relates to the waves. The way the waves move, this is some of the best water we've seen in a Nintendo game, and what's really cool about this is that from what we can tell of the trailer, you can actually seamlessly go underwater and explore an entire underwater environment also as part of the open world. So the scale here is far more significant than your typical open world game. In fact, I'm kind of getting a little bit of Tears of the Kingdom vibes, in the sense that Tears of the Kingdom had not just the surface like in Breath of the Wild, but also integrated caves, the skies, and the depths below, and there was a seamless transition between all these different realms to make one massive open world. We're seeing a little bit of that with Pokémon Winds and Waves, because again, it's not just the surface, but also under the waves. And if that's the case, could there be something to sky exploration as well? So we could be looking at something that's actually extremely expansive, but still seems to have the detail that you might expect from something that's in a limited space that's on rails like in new Pokemon Snap. So we're actually seeing something really impressive here when you keep that in mind. Now something else that has been noted about the trailer is that it's only running at 30 frames per second, and I'll admit, I've been predicting that Pokemon Winds and Waves will run at 60 frames per second, which maybe I will be wrong about, we shall see. But there's some things to keep in mind here. One, from what we've seen so far, Nintendo published titles have been running at 60 frames per second. That seems to be the Nintendo standard so far. But also too, we've seen examples where a game is shown off initially and is not at 60 frames per second, but eventually comes out as a 60 FPS game. The most recent example is Hyrule Warriors Age of Imprisonment. It was shown off just running at 30 frames per second, but by the time the game came out, it was running at a smooth 60 frames per second. And let's keep in mind that what we're seeing here for Pokémon Winds and Waves is very early on footage. The game's not coming out until 2027. I think it's probably going to be early 2027, we shall see. But the point is that it's a year out, which is a longer gap than usual between reveal and release for Pokemon. And actually, usually when we see early on footage, there are some notable improvements by release. So with an even longer amount of time here, there's plenty of reason to think that there's going to be improvements from what we're seeing of this early on footage, and that may even include improved frame rate where we see the game running at 60 frames per second. Will we actually? That remains to be seen, but it's just something to keep in mind here. What we're looking at is not a final product, it's most likely going to end up looking at least a little bit better and perhaps will even run better than what we're seeing already. But before we dive into the comparisons here, let me first point out that I have this goal to reach 60,000 subscribers. So if you find yourself enjoying my videos, I would very much appreciate your support, subscribing if you haven't already. Something that I think is worth bringing up here is how Winds and Waves compares to this leaked image we got back from a few months ago. When we got this leaked image, what we understood wasn't so much that Winds and Waves would look exactly like this, but rather that this was the idea they were going for. And now that we have the actual Winds and Waves trailer, now that we've seen the actual gameplay, I would say from what we've seen so far, it looks like they've gotten really close. Now, obviously, this leaked image is at a very low resolution. That's not necessarily what I'm looking at here, but it's the details that they were shooting for. Having so much foliage, a density to the environment with the plant life. Like that, we have seen they're definitely going for something like that. And the plant life doesn't seem to have simple geometry. With what we're seeing in Winds and Waves, it seems to be extremely comparable. Or something else interesting in this leaked image is how we can see a Charmander in the background, and you can see that his tail is actually lighting up the environment with an orange glow. And we've already seen that there are fire Pokemon that do this in Winds and Waves. We take a look at the Slugma, and they're doing something very similar here. So in terms of foliage, density of environment, scope, more advanced geometry, more advanced lighting effects, everything we're seeing with Winds and Waves seems to be along the lines of what they were aiming for from this leaked image we got a few months ago. So that bodes really well, I would say. But now let's dive into the comparisons here. First, I'm going to look at Scarlet and Violet comparisons, and then we'll do comparisons to new Pokémon Snap. Now, with this first comparison here, it actually shows Scarlet and Violet pretty well. This is a cutscene from Scarlet and Violet. I'm using Switch 1 footage, by the way. I've taken frames and footage from the Switch 1 version, not the enhanced Switch 2 version. And just looking at these two images here side by side, you might even think in some ways that the Scarlet and Violet character looks better. But there are some things to keep in mind here. One, this is all pulled from a YouTube trailer. So this Switch 1 footage has the advantage of being direct feed footage straight from my capture card versus a YouTube video that's going to have a lot of compression. Also, this is early on footage. The game will look better. That all said, it's still interesting because we are talking about a Switch 2 game here, that these character models here are comparable. Now, something that's actually more detailed with the Switch 1 Scarlet and Violet is the hair. You can see with the hair, you can actually see the individual strands. In Winds and Waves, they're actually going for a more simpler look. And I wonder if this is by design so they can aim for performance here and actually be able to put out an open world game that doesn't have issues. So going for a slightly more minimalist look with the characters might help with that. Now, while the hair may be more detailed, there's also more noticeable aliasing. Like, you look at where the hair ends, you can see those jaggy little pixels, while with our character to the right, not so much. So the idea may be to go for more of a simpler look, but also a cleaner look. And when you take into consideration that this is going to be running at a higher resolution, maybe a higher frame rate, we shall see, but in a far more detailed, far more involved open world, I think that's an okay concession. A neat little detail I will point out, though, about the characters in Winds and Waves, you can actually see the wind blowing at their hair. But now let's start to take a look at the water in Scarlet and Violet. This is where things start to become more of an obvious difference here. The water in Scarlet and Violet is pretty basic by comparison. You can see a little bit of translucency here, you can see a little bit of the sand under the water at the very beginning, but there isn't really much else to see under the water. It's very opaque by comparison, and it's not like the waves are really doing anything too complicated either. It's pretty simple. But then with the water in Winds and Waves, it's a substantial leap here. Not only are we seeing the water ripples and the tides and the waves moving around far more realistically, but the translucency is such a significant leap. We can see a whole environment under the water that looks really good. We can see the coral reefs, the rocks. The variation to the environment is far more aesthetically pleasing. And I just want to really highlight how we can see different environments under the water. Like, take a look at this early frame when we're seeing the first few seconds of the Winds and Waves footage here. Notice how there's a big hole, a dark hole under the water. What's under there? There's an implication we can dive even further. And so there's a lot of advantages to the way water is being depicted in Winds and Waves. It shows a whole of the world that we can explore, and we know that we can go underwater. Something that you cannot do at all in Scarlet and Violet, and you can't even see underwater. So there's such a huge difference here. And a reminder, it's not just the way the water looks, but it's the physics as well. Like here in this shot, we can see how there are significant waves here. The way the water is moving about and crashing against each other, we can see the foam and such. This is a significant leap over Scarlet and Violet. But it's not just the water itself, but the way the light interacts with the water. We can see the sun shining across the surface of the water here in this ocean town. We can see varying shadows being casted by the mountainside or by the bridge and the houses that are upon the water surface. We can even see the sunlight hitting the ocean floor. This is actually even evident when we see underwater as well. It looks great. But on the note of shadows, here's a frame from Scarlet and Violet. And this is supposed to be one of the better looking scenes in the game, by the way, because this is when they're introducing you to the starters. And the shadows, well, they look terrible. You can see that they're pixely, blurry messes. They're a very simple approximation of how the shadows would be for each respective character. But then taking a look at this still right here from Winds and Waves, we can see there's actually a lot of shadows going on here, with a very dense environment in terms of foliage, and you can see light shining through, hitting the leaves, hitting the character, hitting the Pokemon. Like look at the light on the Tangela, for example. But also notice how you can see all the different shadows being casted by the Pokemon, by the characters, by the different leaves. You can make out the proper forms. Look at those little palm trees to the right, and then notice the shadows, where you can see the shadows for each individual blade from that tree. So there's far more shadow and lighting detail here. Even in this shot, we can get an even better understanding of the density of the foliage throughout the environment, but also notice the lighting as well, how the sun lights up the canopies above, how it's lighting up the mountainside to the left. It looks really nice. So the lighting and shadow effects have also taken a significant leap here. But let's now talk about the environments. So in Scarlet and Violet, yes, it was an open world, yes, they had a lot of mountains and elevation, and just take a look at this still right here. This shows the early on part to the game, but I think it's actually one of the better looking parts to the game. And as you may notice, it doesn't even really hold that well. You look at all these environments in Winds and Waves, and there's far more variation to the topography, the mountainsides, the paths. There aren't these repeating basic bland textures. Everything looks a lot more detailed. Here's one last still from Scarlet and Violet, and just looking up close, you can see the stone path that is very basic in texture. You can look at the bush behind, you can look at the pumpkins behind, and they look really simple, kind of blurry, not too aesthetically pleasing actually. And then with this still over here, while actually I don't think it looks that amazing, I think compression's taking away from a lot of this. With Winds and Waves, you can still tell there's a lot more detail with the ground textures. You look at the mountains behind, there's so much variation there. You can see the different kinds of rock textures, and then you still have the foliage, you still have the waterfall, the better lighting, the better shadows. It's not close. Scarlet and Violet, when you take a look at the footage, in hindsight, you kind of wonder, how did they release the game in the form that it came out in? It was certainly a controversy. But Winds and Waves by comparison, even with this early on footage that is suffering from YouTube compression, you can tell that the game is pretty. It looks good, it has detail, it has variety to the textures, it doesn't look unpolished, unfinished. It looks like a well-realized world of Pokemon, and that's exciting. But we're not done yet here. We're also going to be comparing Winds and Waves to New Pokémon Snap. New Pokémon Snap before Winds and Waves was considered to be the best looking Pokemon game. Now, New Pokémon Snap is a spin-off, it's not a part of the mainline series, but regardless, it's considered by many to be the best looking Pokemon game to date. I agree. And a lot of people have even made the remark that it almost looks like they took the style of New Pokémon Snap and integrated that into an open world for Winds and Waves. Now, do I believe that's actually the case? There are certainly some similarities here, but I think when we take a closer look and compare them, you'll start to see there are some pretty big notable differences. So taking a look at this footage here for New Pokémon Snap, what you'll see is that, yeah, you can see a very colorful environment, you can see beautiful coral and other things underwater, it looks nice. But if you pause for a moment and you take a closer look at what you can see underwater, you actually cannot see that much. It almost looks like they really lowered the resolution significantly for the underwater environment. Remember that new Pokemon Snap is an on-rails experience, right? It's very linear, it's a very controlled environment. It's not going to be an open world where you can seamlessly dive underwater or go into the skies or anything like that. And so when you do go underwater on new Pokemon Snap, it's essentially a whole other level that's loaded in. So while they're able to hide it a little bit because of the water ripples and the translucency, you can't really make out that much underwater. But when we look at Winds and Waves, you can see the whole environment underwater. It's there, it's visible, it's loaded in. Not to mention you have more realistic waves and ripples going on the surface. But let's take a look at another part to this footage we see from New Snap. Take a look at the sky. The clouds, they're static. They're just there. When we look at Winds and Waves, there's a natural weather system. There are actual winds pushing the clouds. It looks more natural, more believable. And so from just taking a quick look at this one level from New Snap, I can already tell that while New Snap does look good, the visuals in Winds and Waves are more dynamic. It's a more believable, immersive world. But taking a look at an underwater level for New Snap, it looks great. Very colorful still. And at first glance, you might even argue it kind of looks better than what we see of the underwater section for Winds and Waves. We still see the sun shining through on the ocean floor. We also get a look at the surface, but we can actually see like light rays in Winds and Waves, and I think that's important. We don't really see cool effects like that in New Snap. We just see a very shiny surface when we look up. It's a lot more natural looking in Winds and Waves, and when you're looking underwater, it is a little bit more opaque, which I think actually lends more to the believability of the environment. When you're underwater, it's not like everything looks like you're above water. So in New Snap, it's interesting. It's a very beautiful, colorful environment, but it's not a believable one. Being underwater isn't really obscuring your vision in any way, which, is certainly a design choice, but my point is what we're seeing with Winds and Waves looks a lot more believable. Now, looking at this jungly area from Pokemon Snap, we can see a lot of foliage. It's certainly dense, but we can also see up close all of these plants, and they're very simple. And the lighting effects are also very minimal. We've already talked about how there's a lot of foliage in Winds and Waves, but it's not just the density, it's how it works with the environment. You'll notice that the wind actually causes the plants to move around. They're not static. It feels like you're looking at a believable natural environment. You can see the light responding to the environment. And so we're just seeing more examples here how the world in New Snap at first glance is very pretty, but when you take a look at it in motion in comparison to Winds and Waves, the world of New Snap feels very static by comparison. Winds and Waves, from what we've seen so far, looks like a living, breathing world. But that's all I have to say when comparing Pokemon Winds and Waves to both Pokemon Scarlet and Violet and new Pokemon Snap. What have you noticed? What do you make of the visuals of Winds and Waves so far? Let me know in the comments below. This is AndresRestart. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and I will see you all really soon. Take care. Bye.